Hey, welcome to Unsolicited Book Reviews with Michael David MacBride. Hey, that's me. Typically, this is a podcast collection of reviews that I've done of different books, but I'm recording a couple of these special episodes where I invite friends or other people I know, acquaintances, to talk about books that they've chosen. So um, that's what we'll have here is a conversation. It'll be about 25 to 40 minutes long about a book they picked, kind of why they chose that book and how they first heard about it. And then, we'll unpack kind of thoughts that we have about it as well. Ready? Let's go. Thanks for joining me on Unsolicited Book Reviews. Today I'm joined by friend and fellow author Rob Jung. Rob has 4 books, I believe, to your name. Is that
Correct.
correct? Okay. I remembered Cloud Warriors, which happens to be my favorite. Your trilogy, the Chimera Chronicles, which is Reaper, Sower, and Judgment Day, and also, I mean, you're also um, the mastermind behind Minnesota Mystery Night as well. So, what did I miss, Rob? What should we say about you?
Oh, that's plenty. That's but thanks for having me on, and I greatly always appreciate the opportunity to talk about books. Always greatly appreciate and enjoy talking with you. So this is a bonus.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and today the book you chose is, and I listened to it on audiobook, so I just have a piece of paper. The
yeah,
Memory Keeper of Kyiv. Erin Litteken, I think is the author's name. How you say that?
I think that's right.
And I'm kind of curious. How did you come across the book? Like for me, books sometimes they show up on my shelf and I forget where they come from. So I'm just kind of wondering how you stumbled upon it.
This one, this was actually recommended by my wife. Um, She has recently found out that her paternal grandparents, who she always thought were Russian, were actually Ukrainians from Odessa. And it was an interesting history for them, or at least as she viewed it from her viewpoint. They never talked about their life back then, or where they were from and things like that, much like this book. And this book was one she read as part of one of her many book clubs, and said it gave her some great insights into her grandparents, and made her think about and understand things much better than she had before. And I love historical fiction. I write mysteries and thrillers, but historical fiction is my favorite genre. Go figure. Um, and so I thought it would be an interesting book to read. And so that's how we came upon the Memory Keeper of Kyiv. And it obviously has some poignancy for what's going on in the Ukraine today.
Yeah, I mean, I also love historical fiction. So, I mean, you're definitely hitting a sweet spot there for me as well. And my favorite books are definitely something that can teach me something. And while I know a little bit about Ukraine, honestly, a lot of it because of the recent invasion, um, I didn't know much about this past at all. And it was interesting. I'm always curious when a book comes out like this and it's just so timely, how happenstance that is. And in this case, it really seems like the author was writing it well before the invasion and published before the recent Russian invasion. And then it kind of came back to the cycle, with the news now. So
Yeah, I will, you know this as well as I do, because it takes a long time from the time you start writing a book until it's actually ready to be put on a shelf. So if you try to catch on with the newest, what's hot, what the newest trend, you're behind the 8 ball already. So I think Erin Litteken was probably just the recipient of good fortune when it comes to timing.
yeah,
And what this book did for me as I read it, was it made me wonder about the history between these two countries, that I don't know a lot about. But it seems like there is a deep hatred for the Ukrainians, or jealousy or something, from the standpoint of Russia. I mean, they tried to obviously obliterate the population here, with this forced famine, and now they're trying to obliterate the population with, by military means, well, seemingly with no regard for the civilian part of the population. And so there seems to be a track record here between them. And I mentioned that to a friend just a couple of days ago, and we were talking about this, what we're talking about now. And he suggested a book, and I'm gonna throw it out there. It's a book actually written by a great uh, historical novelist named Edward Rutherford, and it's called Ruska, Russka. It was published in 1980, but it is a story about a historical, fictional but historical telling of Russia and Eastern Europe from way back when. So he said that he read it a long time ago. He said, but it had a lot to say about the relationship between the two countries. So I
Well,
think that's somewhere on my stack of to be read not too far in the future.
I was gonna say I just scribbled it down, and for people I guess who have no understanding of what this book is about, I mean, and it goes back and forth between the 1930s and I don't know what, like 2004, I think.
Something
So
like
the 1930s is in Ukraine, and then the 2004 is the family in Illinois, primarily, I believe. And you really have the grandmother story. I mean, I guess it's a mild spoiler, but you don't know initially what the story is in the 30s, other than there's this family struggling through a famine that they don't fully understand. And they come later to appreciate that it was a forced famine by the Russian government. And then in 2004, you kind of have this family who suffered a loss, and then the granddaughter is connecting with the grandmother who they believe is suffering from dementia and kind of having these weird moments that they can't quite understand. And of course, in any good fiction, those stories come together at some point and kind of parallel each other as well. Um, yeah, it is interesting, and from my understanding of the author, she has this Ukrainian background as well, and so some of the story came to her as she's trying to understand her own family past, kind of like Cassie, I guess, in the story, the younger granddaughter. Is that
I think it's a bit autobiographical, actually. I mean, that is most first novels are. Um, this is, uh, I would be surprised if this isn't picked up and made into a movie. We probably won't recognize it because I don't think they'll do the switching back and forth. But it has, it is a very, it's in a way, it's an ominous book for today. Um, the part about what went on in the Ukraine in the 1930s and this forced famine called Holodomor, which I had never heard of until I read this book.
me neither?
Apparently,
Yeah.
so it got buried um, in the news cycles of those past years because allegedly we needed Stalin's help to deal with Hitler. And so anything that Stalin did that wasn't good, we glossed over, ignored. And so unless you, I think, lived in Eastern Europe or Russia, you didn't even know this existed. It actually, um, it was more than just the Ukraine. It crossed into several other European countries, this forced famine, and killed something like 7.5 million people over the course of 3 or 4 years. It's amazing. What makes it ominous is the collectivization or the description of collectivization and how they turned families against each other and you know used violence and to accomplish their ends. And you think about today, and you think about January 6th, and you think about the division in this country, and it's particularly scary on how easily you can disassemble a society by sowing um, doubt and fear um, to to meet the ends of a dictator in this case. Um,
Yeah, and in this particular case, it was, I mean, I think the thing that was most shocking to me was that ultimately they find all of their food being housed in a place where it is just rotting.
yeah,
There's one thing when there is a emperor, who is gathering things and hoarding it and, living lavishly. And then there's a whole nother when you just literally are wasting for the sake of waste. I mean, there was
yeah,
really no benefit
yeah,
to, it wasn't like the leadership was selling the food on the black market and making a killing or any kind of monetary gain. It just was cruel and wasteful.
yeah. This was genocide in the cruelest way. Um, it is it's disturbing. The same day that I finished reading this, that evening, my wife and I sat and watched a movie called The Mauritanian. It was done in 2021, won a bunch of Golden Globe awards and that sort of thing. Jodie Foster was the main character, but it's the story of a man from Mauritania who, for reasons that were very flimsy, was accused of being the mastermind of 9/11
Oh, wow.
and was held at Guantanamo for 16 years without ever being charged with anything. It's a true story. I'm sure there's some literary license done in the movie, but when you look at the cruelty and the inhuman treatment that was perpetrated on that person by our military, and then you add what went on in the 1930s in Ukraine after just reading the Memory Keeper of Kyiv, and you think, boy, we are an eyelash away from that, or could
Yeah.
be, you know?
It definitely feels like, I mean, I know they say history history repeats itself, and those
Right.
who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. But it feels like sometimes people maybe look back and go, "Hey, that was a good idea. We should try that again," which is just, like it's I don't know,
Yeah.
it's terrifying. And yeah, the other thing I think that struck me about the book that was kind of interesting, and you mentioned this before, was that lapse of knowledge, like how the family immigrates and then doesn't talk about their past. And in this book, it very neatly, the daughter, um, Bobby, Bobby knows nothing of her grandmother's past or her
Cassie,
mother's past.
Cassie's the daughter, Bobby's the grandmother.
Okay. Oh, okay. Gotcha. Oh, okay. Thank you. So
I wrote it down so I'd remember.
gotcha. I appreciate it. And I read it a little bit ago, so I forgot. Sorry. But but anyway, like she doesn't know, the daughter doesn't know anything about her mom's experience. And then the younger generation comes along and starts asking questions. And then suddenly this other window kind of opens up. It's like that history has missed a generation entirely, which is kind of
Yeah.
interesting to think about. Like, I mean, I know family members, who survived wars and didn't want to talk about their experience serving overseas, or um, but I can't imagine having that big of a hole in the family past and not, especially something this traumatic,
Yeah.
and not knowing that your family underwent that.
It's like, I mean, the decades of history that has just disappeared. Um, it is a really interesting story. It made me cry at the end, but because of the daughter that they thought they lost when she was taken away by the communists. turns up at the end thanks to social media to be able to find that she actually has a sister and family that are still alive.
Yeah, one of the good things of social media.
Yeah, yes, can be used for good things,
A
but
positive instance. Yeah.
so I was going to mention something else about this book that I thought that was particularly interesting. Uh, was how the effect of that lack of history that you just pointed out, that absence of communication, the loss of the family thread, if you will, impacted the woman who this Cassie, who's the real protagonist of the modern part of this story, and left her with a great inability to deal with her own. Um, she lost her husband, and her struggle to deal with that and to move on was an interesting parallel to the kind of, not without the violence and without the starvation, but an interesting parallel of what her grandmother had gone through, 60 years earlier in it must have more, yeah, 70 years earlier in the Ukraine. So the parallels were done well. I thought this, for a first novel, it was done well. It's got some, it's not the greatest written book that I've ever read. It's got some flaws in it, but nevertheless, the story is an awesome story. And anytime you can find something in history that has been buried and shed some light on it, that's one of the great honors of being a fiction writer.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I find a lot of times in historical fiction, they try to do a neat parallel, right? Where like the past is going through this thing, and then here is
Mhm.
the present going through a similar version. And but my problem often with that setup is those things never compare. Like how do you compare a loss of 3 to 10 million, depending on how many people, which source you look at,
Yeah,
lives versus the loss of your husband, and you can't really, and of course you always hope that the later generations have it better than the past, and certainly like that's played out here, but you're right. I mean, the mother ends up stuck in this place of trying to find her way out of grief and just kind of being buried, and trying to raise a child. And that, I think part of that is symbolized also in um, the young daughter who's mute by choice, for
yeah,
a while.
yeah,
Um, but it's kind of a convention, I think. But I think you're right. I mean, I think it's an interesting way that Litteken does work with the past and present, giving them different problems, but kind of
mhm,
struggling with that,
yeah.
getting over the grieving process. So
Well, I would recommend the book to number one, anybody that likes historical fiction, but more importantly, I think anybody who has any sort of interest in or concern about what is going on in the Ukraine and what is going on in on the political scene in the United States, because I
yeah,
think is it is a book that has a warning in it.
yeah, it's
Make
got
make
it.
It made me think about if how easy it would be to have that happen here, and who's going to stand up and fight. Who's, what are you willing to sacrifice to try to keep hang on to the democracy that we have, this grand experiment we live in. So
Yeah, well, and
yeah.
and I think and something else it has going for it in terms of recommending it is it has strong female characters. I know that's often something that's popular as well. There is one neighbor guy, who helps out as well with translations and that kind of stuff, which um, works. And he
It was a
it's
necessary convention.
It was interesting how, and I wish that if there was a wish I had with the book, it would be I wish I knew more about why his family chose to be committed to preserving the history. Like that was an interesting connection there. Like he was taught Ukrainian, he was taught the language, he had to go to school, he knew about the history, his family talked about it. And I didn't, that was one thing where I was like, ooh, I'd like to know more about why it worked here but didn't work here if they both went through the same thing. But I
That's a good.
suppose, I suppose it's like anything, people go through different experiences and they come out the other side and they react to it in different ways. Some people grieve quickly or, by sharing stories, and other hold it close to their chest and don't want to move on. So, uh,
I think the author tried to handle that very, very briefly. If I remember correctly, there was a mention that his family was from a different area of the Ukraine that wasn't hit, by this. It wasn't from a rural area that was hit by this famine, as nearly as hard anyway. So
gotcha. Yeah,
that's the only thing that I can figure out would be her attempt to try to justify the difference in the historical backgrounds.
sure. Well, and I'll say the audiobook was very good. I enjoyed it. Like it moved very quick. I think I don't remember who it was who did the voicing, unfortunately, but they did a good job of, varying up the voice so that you knew who was talking without, waiting for a dialogue tag or something like that to come up. So I'm curious in the print version, because I assume you read the print one.
Yes.
Are there any maps or images or anything like that that I missed out on? Usually that's something I'll do is I'll go to the library and I'll at least look at the physical version and see if I missed something.
Let's see. I don't believe there was. No,
Okay.
no, there are no maps. Would have been interesting to see that where this specific area was, where this took place. I didn't realize how big a country the Ukraine was until the current war. But it's a sizable chunk of real estate. Um,
Yeah.
so it'd be interesting. But it is, I mean, it's been known as sort of the breadbasket of Eastern Europe, and it's also it has been in the past known as sort of the coal mine of Eastern Europe as well. And as I presume those are from different areas of the country. But so it's an interesting thing. One of the things, another parallel that doesn't have anything necessarily to do with this book, but has to do with another book that I've added to my list. Um, Another famine that was created by a communist rule occurred in Ethiopia in the 1990s. Um, the Haile Selassie, who was the emperor of Ethiopia and was quite content to be the emperor of a urban or a rural, farmer country, was overthrown by the communists in I think early 1980s. And the communists controlled the country for 17 years. And in the 17 years they controlled the country, they created a famine exactly like the one that is described in this book, where they were
Wow.
carrying, they were hauling bodies out of the famine area in truckloads on a daily basis. And I had some personal experience with that because my wife was working in Africa at that time. And I actually went to Ethiopia about 2 years after the communist government was ousted and a pseudo democracy was put in place. Um, but it was the same kind of intentional almost famine where the produce of the farming community was confiscated and the farmers were left to, well, in some cases, basically they had to denude the landscape to get firewood and things like that. And there's a book out that I just got. Hold on a second. Right there.
Sure.
Another historical book called Cutting for
Oh yeah.
Stone, which is the story of Ethiopia told through the eyes of two brother doctors. And so that's also along with Ruska on my list of just, I don't know about you, but just reading history is boring. But if you read it in a sense of historical fiction written by an author who has spent a great deal of time researching and a great deal of effort making sure the details are correct, you can be entertained at the same time you learn an awful lot about other cultures and other geographical areas, that sort of thing.
It's definitely one of my
So
favorite things about historical fiction, for sure. I'm
that's
curious. I didn't know that about you spending time in Africa. I remembered Kathy saying that she had spent time there, but I didn't realize it was that close to Ethiopia. Did you had you heard about the forced famine, or like what was your awareness in that moment about?
um, we're very much aware because the church we went to was involved with an organization called World Vision, which is an NGO, worldwide NGO, that had a great deal of involvement with that famine area. And World Vision, Kathy volunteered for them for about, I don't know, 8, 10 years, and then they hired her. And for 17 years, she worked for World Vision and spent the first 8 or 9 of those in Africa, and then the last 8 or 9 of those in Peru. But as a consequence, I got to go to lots of exotic places, if you want to call third world countries exotic places. But so I was actually, the famine was in like I think it was in the mid 1980s, mid to latter 1980s. I was in Ethiopia in 1995 or six, and at the place that was the epicenter of the famine was called the Ansokia Valley. And I'm sorry, the Mathari. No, I was right first time, Ansokia Valley. Um, and it had become once again the breadbasket when the farmers were allowed to go back and do what they do with the help of the NGOs who supplied a lot of you know infrastructure and support. But the history of it was quite uh, astounding and tragic, if you will. And this
Yeah.
book reminded me of that experience again because of the same man-made effort and of or the the malice of a dictator when one person can make all those kinds of decisions and you're subject to the whim of whatever their basest desires are, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's not, I guess it's similar, but I guess I also thought a lot about just how colonization plays out, and how when you have a colony, um, you can dictate what you want them to grow, whether or not it's what should grow there or grows there well. And I know, like in the early 1900s, and this wasn't really a colony situation. This was um, a uh, a money thing where the banana republics spring up, and they are happy to pay dictators to chop down foods that grow to sustain the population to then grow bananas because that's what we wanted internationally, and the people who struggled as a result of that it creates this cycle of neediness. Like, okay, we've cut down our food crop, we're growing bananas, now we need to buy crops from elsewhere, and so there's this reciprocal nature of just wealth being displaced. And I don't know. In this case, in the case of Memory Keeper, it was a matter of a forced famine, and it seemed like there was no monetary benefit other than just cruelty, and wanting to literally eliminate millions of people.
And you wonder, I mean, I don't know the answer, and it wasn't made apparent by this book, and I hope to learn more about it. But you wonder if the purpose, the motivation wasn't for Stalin to basically obliterate the Ukrainian population and replace it with Russian people of Russian heritage, because there are, as we know, chunks of eastern Ukraine that are heavily populated with people who are Russian by nationality. So I wonder if
Yeah.
that wasn't the game plan, and if that isn't the game plan today, you know.
Yeah, and it's always books like this. I do love that they, tell this story that's forgotten. But, like whenever a war breaks out or there is some kind of disagreement, you can almost always point to something that came before it. Like, okay, what caused this? Where is this bad blood coming from? What is this hatred about? And if you sometimes you don't even need to look 70 years back to find where that is, but we've forgotten about it because the news cycle has passed or whatever. But anyway.
Years ago, I did a lot of reading. This is years ago, but about the fall of the Russian Empire when the communists took control and all that sort of stuff. And there was nothing in anything I read that I recall anyway that really spoke of Ukraine or any of the other Eastern Russian countries. It was a
Huh.
very much an internal struggle, civil war. So I don't know if it was back in the Tsarist times that this all happened, or if it was just the need for the resources that the Ukraine provided, or what it was. But there's certainly something there that is a deep thread of dislike. That's an understatement. That's a kind word to use for the animosity that seems to exist between at least the political aspects of the two countries.
Sure.
So,
Well, cool. Thank you so much for joining me and chatting about Memory Keeper of Kyiv. You can find more about Rob online if you want at robyoungwriter.com or Minnesota Mystery Night. You can check those out. Those are fun. I'm going to the one in May, who I know is Brian Luterman. I don't remember who's coming up in March. Do you know off the top of your head?
March is Jess Lowry
Oh, that's right.
and Christy Belcamino as her conversation partner. Jess is probably the mystery author who's won the most awards in the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, she is smoking hot in terms of her writing. So
She did Quarry Girls, right? Was that
Story
the
Girl, yeah,
okay?
that won the Anthony Award last year, I think, or maybe the year before, and she's up for um, an Edgar this year,
Wow.
um, which is for those who are listening to this don't know, it is considered to be the most prestigious of all the awards for mystery and thriller writers. It's awarded by the Mystery Writers of America on an annual basis. So she's up for that, and so is William Kent Kruger, who was one of our guests last month. So
Yeah.
we're on a roll.
Awesome.
Yeah, yeah,
Well,
it's good.
thanks so much for joining me, man. It was great to chat with you. I love talking books.
Good to talk to you, and thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks for listening. You can find out more about me at my webpage, michaelmacbride.com, or on most social media platforms with the same handle, at Michael MacBride. That's MacBride, like Mac and Bride. Let me know what you're listening to, or if you read one of these books, leave me a comment and let me know what you thought. Have a great day.